Konstantin Tsiolkovsky calculated the physics of space travel decades before a single rocket left the ground. Yet, to the neighbors in his small village, he was simply an eccentric man in a rumpled coat who lived in a house full of strange papers. This gap between internal vision and external perception is a recurring feature of history. From thinkers like Socrates to the early Gnostics, the people who actually advance human understanding are frequently sidelined by the very communities they are trying to elevate. This friction points to a deep biological divide. On one side, you have an intellect striving for a higher state of evolution. On the other, the massive gravitational weight of a population governed by animalistic drives. Viewed through this lens, human progress isn't a collective march forward. It appears as an asymmetric struggle, where the breakthroughs of a few are constantly stalled by the active resistance of the many. This isn't a new observation. Platonic and Gnostic traditions have long argued that humanity isn't a single, uniform mass, but is instead divided into two distinct biological and spiritual classes. The first is the thinker, or the pneumatic. This individual is defined by a willingness to sacrifice social standing, physical comfort, and even personal relationships to pursue abstract knowledge and scientific truth. The second category is the primitive, or the Hylic. According to this framework, this represents the majority of the population, people whose mental capacity is entirely focused on the basic instincts of consumption, superficial status, and momentary pleasure. This cycle defines the primitive's existence. They alternate between mindless labor and shallow entertainment because they are terrified of what might happen if they actually stop to think. Deep reflection would force them to see the repetitive nature of their lives. For the thinker, simply existing in the same physical world as this majority becomes an act of daily psychological survival. To understand how this conflict plays out in real life, imagine one thinker living in a communal apartment with 9 primitives. The thinker's first instinct is to observe the environment and build systems to improve it, designing a better hot water heater, optimizing the electricity, or setting up a high-speed data network for the benefit of everyone in the house. The others immediately reject these improvements. They prefer the familiar mess. They would rather spend their money on alcohol and cheap food than invest the effort required to maintain a more sophisticated way of living. They don't just ignore him, they force him to conform. They insist he join their celebrations to ensure he is normalized through debauchery, viewing his quiet focus as a direct threat to their collective comfort. Because the majority considers their own state to be the objective norm, they interpret the thinker's refusal to participate in their vices as a hostile insult. The thinker views their junk food and mindless media as an assault on his mental clarity. He chooses isolation over what he sees as cognitive dirt. This refusal wounds the ego of the group. Since they cannot understand his motivations, they label him as insane, a drug addict, or social deviant, any category that allows them to ignore the validity of his perspective. Misunderstanding soon turns into active sabotage. They mock his work, disrupt his concentration, and intentionally break the systems he tried to build for the group. This hostility is often masked by shallow displays of morality. They might visit churches or talk about community values, but their actions are driven by a parasitic resentment of anyone who attempts to live differently. This friction functions as a biological immune response. The collective instinctively attempts to neutralize an evolutionary outlier it cannot comprehend. If you scale that communal kitchen up to the level of modern government, you start to see the systemic problem facing our species. When a society relies on the will of the numerical majority, it stops selecting for vision and starts selecting for the path of least resistance. This is how democracy can slide into a state of reverse selection. In this environment, individuals with the most basic drives are the ones who ascend to unearned power. They succeed not through vision, but by mirroring the appetites of the crowd. The result is a system that legally protects degradation, subsidizing vice and junk food, while actively stifling the quiet, resource-heavy environments where true intellectual breakthroughs occur. By letting the lowest common denominator dictate our survival, we are effectively choosing to destroy our own evolutionary potential. To prevent this slide into permanent stagnation, Thinkers like Ari Radoslav argue for a radical alternative, a Theotechnocratic model. This system is designed to reverse the damage of majority rule by prioritizing evolutionary growth over mass opinion. Under this model, the pyramid of power is flipped into an arrow. Governance is restricted to those focused on long-term development. Their goal is to automate and optimize the species' base needs, synthesizing nutrition and streamlining energy to free the human mind from animalistic requirements. To someone who defines their life by momentary consumption and the freedom to indulge in vice, this highly disciplined society would look like a restrictive nightmare. But the next time you see an eccentric outcast who rejects the norms of modern life, look closer. They may not be broken. They might simply be the only ones designing our future, while the rest of us are busy consuming the